This week's lecture is going to prepare us to begin actually looking at the different books in the Bible and some of the critical issues in terms of the literature of the Old Testament. And to do that, we need to actually ask ourselves, what is the text that we're reading? And textual criticism is the discipline that actually studies and reflects on and tries to make sure that the Bible, the words that we find in our Bibles, are actually the words that are supposed to be in our Bibles. And let's talk about some assumptions that we make when we're trying to determine what the original text would have actually said, what it would have looked like. And we're talking about the original Hebrew for the Old Testament, also Aramaic. That's the second language in the Old Testament. Aramaic is found in the books of Ezra, parts of them, parts of Daniel, and there's a verse in Jeremiah, but it's mostly Hebrew. And then in the New Testament, of course, it would be Greek. But textual criticism makes a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that there was an original, usually called the autograph. The original autograph, the original final version of the book as produced by the original author or authors or editors. And that presumably it was originally pure. And the second assumption that text criticism makes is that the available copies that we have are in some way corrupted. Again, in the modern world, like if we do something with our computers, we can print out unlimited copies that are exactly the same as we have on our file. There may be typos and stuff in there, but whatever we want to print out shows up. In the ancient world, there's because of just the issues that come in producing books, you can only produce more copies either by having someone read out loud a copy and other people write it down, kind of via dictation, or one person sits with a copy or with a manuscript and then makes one single copy. And both of those forms of copying produce errors because it's very difficult to transcribe something perfectly. And so when we talk about sometimes inerrancy, like for example our seminary statement of faith, without error in all it affirms, we have to understand the whole issue of authority in terms of what it would have been in the original text. And so sometimes you'll actually see statements of faith that talk about the Bible and their original autograph are without error. And so they're trying to take out of the equation potential errors that have slipped into the Bible via just the transmission of the text itself. But anyway, there's two basic types of errors that happen, and these are dependent upon which type of copying you're doing. There's unintentional errors, and those can be with the eyes or the ears, again getting back to the kind of copying, and then there's intentional errors. But let's talk about some of the unintentional errors that can be done when you're making a copy just by looking at the document and then producing it. First of all, sometimes some of the letters can look very similar, and if you're not being careful in the copying, you can mistake one letter for another. Again, this is assuming we have handwritten copies of things, and certain Hebrew letters tend to look the same. And if you don't know Hebrew, you can barely discern maybe even some of the differences in the letters right here. And these are nice block, true type fonts. But notice how close some of these letters that I have up here are together. You're making a copy, it's old, it's smudged. Maybe you can't quite make out the letter, and so you introduce an error into the manuscript. And sometimes those are catchable, like if we would find a misspelling, we might find that. But what if the word that you misspell actually is another word and it looks like it could fit the context? That would be very difficult to catch. Then there's haplography and dittography. Haplography happens when you're copying a manuscript, and let's say that you leave off, you're copying a manuscript and you come to the word church, and so you go and write your sentence that ends with church in your new copy. Then you go back to the original to find out where your place was, and let's say you go to the place where you find the word church. But let's say you've actually skipped down farther, so you've actually left something out because the word church shows up in a couple different places in the original. Haplography is when you skip lines when you go to find where you were. Dittography is where you go back to a previous place and recopy something. But we have evidence of both of those kind of errors happening. Again, haplography is where you go back to the copy or the original and you skip a portion of the text. Dittography is when you go back and you actually recopy something twice. Now there's also some errors of the ear, and the errors of the ear take place from homonyms. So or misunderstanding. So like if the word to in English, that could be T-O-O, it could be T-O, it could be T-W-O. That's going to be dependent on context. Or we can make some jokes. Let's say I have a southern accent and I say a raffle. And you're from the north, you might think I'm talking about a raffle ticket, when in fact I might be talking about a gun, a raffle, or a heel. Is a heel a back of somebody's foot, or is it a small little mountain? Again, that's going to depend on your context. I don't mean to making fun of dialects, but those are errors that could happen with your ears if somebody's reading a manuscript and you're not being really careful about what the copy is. So those are some of the unintentional errors that could take place. Now there's also intentional errors. And you think, why would you intentionally change something? Well, let's have a look at these. Well, let's say, for example, that you find a misspelled word and you fix it. Well, you've just changed the manuscript, because let's say the original manuscript had a misspelling in it. If you correct the spelling, you've actually intentionally changed it, even if it's for the better. Or if you've updated it, let's say you take all the these and thous out and you make them and you update those. Or maybe you have the British version of spelling a word and you go with the American version of spelling a word. You've intentionally changed the document. Or if you've improved the grammar, maybe something reads fairly difficult in the text from which you're copying, and you said, you know what, I want to clear that up a little bit, and you change the grammar. You may have basically kept the meaning, you may have made it easier to understand, but guess what? You've intentionally changed the manuscript. Same with style. You can make stylistic changes. Substitution for archaic words. I've already talked about these and thous, but just taking out a word that might have lost its meaning and substituting a newer word that, again, says the same thing as the original, but you've changed it intentionally. There's also examples of theological corrections. For example, the Jehovah's Witness Bible was an example of this. There's several places where they make key changes for theological reasons. For Old Testament example, there's a place in Genesis where it says Abraham stood before the Lord, and we have manuscripts that then change it to Abraham bowed down before the Lord, because in the mind of the scribe, it's inconceivable that Abraham would have stood before the Lord. He would have, of course, bowed down, so they make that change. And also glosses. A gloss is when there's a little note that a previous scribe has written into the margins of a document. And the problem is, though, if you're making a copy, and ancient manuscripts wrote basically side to side, and they made use of the full piece of they used all this available space on whatever they were writing on. And so the problem would be, especially since these are handwritten, is what if the gloss looks like it's supposed to be part of the original? Again, if you're a pious scribe making a copy, you're more likely to include it than exclude it, because you don't want to miss out on part of God's Word. So sometimes people's little handwritten notes in the margins make their way into a manuscript.